It started as a routine traffic stop on a quiet afternoon, the kind of mundane event that inflates an arrogant rookie's ego and ruins an innocent person's day. Officer Harlan Crow thought he had caught a nobody driving a luxury car she could not possibly afford in an affluent neighborhood where he felt she did not belong. He slapped the cuffs on her, ignoring her calm, icy warnings, fully expecting to humiliate her later in front of a magistrate. But Harlan was about to learn a brutal, career-ending lesson about power, prejudice, and karma. Because the woman he dragged into the justice system was not just a citizen, she was the system itself. The dashboard clock in the patrol cruiser showed the afternoon hour. A light, persistent drizzle slicked the immaculately paved streets of Oak Brook, a wealthy suburban enclave known for its sprawling, manicured lawns, iron gates, and residents who valued quiet above all else. Officer Harlan Crow tapped his thumbs against the steering wheel, his jaw working a piece of spearmint gum. He had been on the force for several years, long enough to believe he had the instincts of a seasoned detective, but not quite long enough to realize how deeply flawed those instincts actually were. Harlan considered himself the gatekeeper of Oak Brook. He liked the power of the badge, the way the heavy leather duty belt felt around his waist, and the way people's eyes darted away when he made eye contact. Ahead of him, idling at a red light, was a pristine black Mercedes-Benz S-Class with tinted rear windows. The car itself was not out of place in Oak Brook, but through the clear glass of the driver's side window, Harlan could see the driver. It was a black woman. She was dressed down, wearing a faded gray collegiate sweatshirt, her hair pulled back into a messy bun, and a pair of dark sunglasses perched on her head. Despite the overcast sky, Harlan's eyes narrowed. In his mind, an algorithm heavily weighted by unconscious bias and unearned arrogance began to compute. Stolen car? He thought. Maybe a domestic worker taking the boss's car for a joyride. The light turned green. The Mercedes accelerated smoothly. Harlan pulled his cruiser into traffic, staying exactly 2 car lengths behind. He ran the plates through the mobile data terminal mounted on his console. The system pinged back. Registered to Lena Harper. No outstanding warrants. Clean title. The clean return irritated him. It did not fit the narrative he had just constructed in his head. He watched the Mercedes approach a 4-way stop. The vehicle came to a complete halt behind the white line. Then it signaled right and made the turn. Gotcha, Harlan whispered to the empty cruiser. According to the strictest, most pedantic reading of the state traffic code, a driver was required to activate their turn signal a full 100 feet before initiating a turn. The Mercedes had signaled approximately 50 feet before the intersection. It was the kind of petty infraction that officers ignored 99 times out of 100, used solely as a pretext for a stop when they wanted to fish for something bigger. Harlan hit the overhead lights. Red and blue flashed against the wet pavement. He tapped the siren, a quick, aggressive whoop whoop. Inside the Mercedes, Lena Harper looked in her rearview mirror. She let out a soft, exasperated sigh. It had been a long morning. She had spent the last several hours reviewing hundreds of pages of dense appellate briefs, and she had just driven to the local artisanal bakery to grab a sourdough loaf before heading home to finish her reading. She pulled the heavy luxury car smoothly onto the shoulder, shifting it into park and lowering her window. She placed both hands visibly on the leather-wrapped steering wheel, a habit born of necessity and survival. Harlan adjusted his utility belt, puffing out his chest as he stepped out into the drizzle. He walked with a deliberate, slow swagger, approaching the passenger side first, scanning the pristine beige leather interior before rounding the trunk and approaching the driver's side window. License, registration, and proof of insurance, Harlan demanded, leaning in close. He did not offer a greeting. He did not state the reason for the stop. His tone was clipped, authoritative, and dripping with condescension. Lena turned her head, her expression entirely neutral. She possessed striking features, but it was her eyes that demanded attention, sharp, observant, and entirely devoid of the nervous flutter most people exhibited when pulled over. "Good afternoon, officer," Lena said, her voice smooth and deeply modulated, the tone of someone very accustomed to commanding a room. "May I ask why I'm being stopped?" "I ask the questions here. License and registration now," Harlan snapped, resting his hand on his radio. Lena did not flinch. Slowly, deliberately, she moved her right hand toward the glove compartment. "I'm retrieving my registration," she narrated. She pulled out a small leather folio, then reached into her pocket to extract her driver's license. She handed them through the window. Harlan snatched them. He looked at the license. Lena Harper. He looked at the woman in the faded sweatshirt. "Whose car is this?" "Mine," Lena replied calmly. "You bought a $120,000 car. What do you do for a living?" Harlan asked, his smirk poorly hidden. I work for the county, Lena answered. It was the truth, albeit a heavily understated one. Right. County worker in an S-class. Step out of the vehicle, please, Harlan ordered, stepping back and gesturing with his hand. Lena's hands remained on the wheel. Officer Crow? Lena said, reading his silver name tag. Under Pennsylvania v. Mims, you have the right to order me out of the vehicle during a lawful traffic stop. However, I'm requesting that you state the articulable suspicion or probable cause for the stop before we proceed further. Harlan's face flushed red. He despised backseat lawyers, citizens who watched a few crime shows and thought they knew the law. But the woman in front of him was not quoting a TV show. She was quoting Supreme Court precedent with terrifying precision. You failed to signal 100 feet before the intersection of Elm Grove, Harlan said, his voice rising in volume. Now step out of the car before I pull you out for failing to comply with a lawful order. Lena held his gaze for a long, agonizing second. Very well. She unbuckled her seatbelt and opened the door. Even in yoga pants and a sweatshirt, she carried herself with an imposing dignity. She stood a few inches shorter than Harlan, but somehow the physical difference felt entirely irrelevant. Turn around and place your hands on the roof of the car, Harlan barked. Officer Crow, Lena said, I'm unarmed. I'm complying with your orders. However, I strongly suggest you reconsider your next action. You are escalating a minor pretextual traffic stop into an unlawful detention. This will not end well for you. Her absolute lack of fear infuriated him. She was not yelling. She was not crying. She was advising him, almost pitying him. Are you threatening a police officer? Harlan growled, stepping into her personal space, trying to use his physical size to intimidate her. I'm stating a legal fact, Lena replied, her voice dropping an octave, ringing with an icy authority. Do not touch me. Harlan's ego could not take it. In his mind, she was disrespecting the badge. She was disrespecting him. He grabbed her left arm, twisting it behind her back with unnecessary force. Lena winced slightly, but her voice remained chillingly steady. You are making a grave mistake, Officer Crow. You are under arrest for disorderly conduct and resisting an officer, Harlan declared, unhooking the metal handcuffs from his belt. The heavy metal clicked and ratcheted tightly around Lena Harper's wrists. He patted her down roughly, finding nothing but a set of house keys and a cell phone before forcefully guiding her to the back of his cruiser. He pushed her into the hard plastic back seat of the patrol car. As he slammed the door shut, he felt a rush of triumphant adrenaline. He had put her in her place. Inside the cruiser, Lena Harper sat perfectly upright, the cold metal biting into her wrists. She looked out the window at the rain, her mind already organizing the statutes, the internal affairs protocols, and the civil rights violations that had just occurred. She was not scared. She was furious, and her fury was a profoundly dangerous thing. The atmosphere inside the precinct was chaotic, filled with the ringing of telephones, the static of police radios, and the distinct stale smell of cheap coffee and floor wax. Officer Harlan Crow marched through the double doors, a tight grip on Lena Harper's bicep. He paraded her through the bullpen, making sure his colleagues saw him. He wanted them to see that he had bagged someone who thought she was above the law. Officer David Miller, a longtime veteran with a receding hairline and a permanent scowl, looked up from his paperwork. What do we have here, Crow? Looks like a tough one, he said, his tone dripping with mild sarcasm. Disorderly, resisting, and driving like she owns the damn road, Harlan boasted loudly. Thought she could talk her way out of it by throwing some legal mumbo-jumbo at me. Lena remained completely silent. She did not look at the ground. She kept her chin up, her eyes calmly tracking the layout of the precinct, the names on the desks, the faces of the officers. She was committing everything to memory. Harlan led her to the booking desk. Behind the elevated counter sat Sergeant Thomas Riker, a man counting the days to his retirement. Riker looked down through his reading glasses, taking a sip of his lukewarm coffee. Name? Riker grunted, looking at Lena. Lena Harper, she replied clearly. Riker paused. The name tickled something in the back of his mind, a distant bell of recognition, but in the context of a woman in a faded sweatshirt and handcuffs, he could not place it. He typed her name into the booking system. All right, Crow, take her for prints and a photo, Riker said, waving them away. In the fingerprinting room, Harlan uncuffed her left hand. Press your thumb down. Don't smudge it, he commanded. Lena complied gracefully. She moved through the degrading process of booking with an eerie detachment. When she was instructed to stand against the height chart for her mugshot, she did not scowl or cry. She stared directly into the camera lens with a look of absolute, terrifying resolve. The flash popped, capturing an image that would later become a highly contested piece of evidence. After the photo, Harlan escorted her to a temporary holding cell, a 10 by 10 cage of iron bars and cinder block. He locked the heavy door, the metallic clank echoing loudly down the corridor. "You get one phone call. Use it wisely," Harlan sneered, leaning against the bars. "I would like to make my call now," Lena said. Harlan fetched a cordless phone from a desk and passed it through the bars. He stood there, arms crossed, expecting to hear her cry to a husband or panic to a bail bondsman. Instead, Lena dialed a number from memory. She waited 3 rings. "Robert, it's Lena," she said, her voice dropping to a low, serious timbre. "I'm at the precinct in Oak Brook. I've been arrested by an officer, Harlan Crow." She paused, listening to the voice on the other end. A tiny, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of her lips. "Yes, really. Pretextual stop, unlawful arrest, excessive force, and fabricated charges of resisting and disorderly." Harlan frowned. The terminology she was using was too exact. "No, do not come down here and make a scene," Lena continued into the phone. "Just arrange for my release on my own recognizance. Let the process play out. Let Officer Crow put his statements on the official record. I want the paperwork completely filed." She paused again. "Thank you, Robert. I'll see you later." She handed the phone back through the bars. "Who was that?" Harlan asked, trying to keep his voice steady, though a tiny sliver of doubt had suddenly wedged itself into his gut. "My attorney," Lena said simply, sitting down on the hard metal bench and crossing her legs. Harlan scoffed, turning on his heel. "We'll see how good he is." Back at his desk, Harlan began to write the arrest report. This was where cops like him made their money. He knew how to craft a narrative. He wrote that the suspect was visibly agitated, refused lawful commands, made furtive movements, and physically pulled away, necessitating a control hold. He painted a picture of a belligerent, out-of-control citizen who left him no choice but to arrest her for his own safety. He signed the bottom of the sworn affidavit, feeling quite satisfied with his creative writing. Hours later, Sergeant Riker called Harlan over to the desk. Riker looked slightly pale. "Crow, process her out. She's being released on her own recognizance," Riker said, rubbing his temples. "On her own recognizance?" Harlan protested. "She fought me, Sarge." "The order came down from the magistrate's office directly," Riker said, his voice dropping. Her lawyer called the duty judge. Just process the paperwork and get her out of here, Crow. I don't want a headache today." Harlan gritted his teeth. He grabbed the release paperwork and walked back to the holding cell. He unlocked the door. "You're out. Sign here," he grumbled, shoving a clipboard at her. Lena reviewed the release form carefully. She read every single line of the conditions of release before signing her name with a flourish. Harlan handed her a clear plastic bag containing her phone and keys. She took the bag, adjusted her sweatshirt, and walked out of the cell. She stopped just inches from Harlan. The precinct was bustling around them, but in that small space, the air felt completely still. "Officer Crow," Lena said, her voice soft but cutting through the ambient noise like a scalpel. "You have sworn an oath to uphold the law, yet you operate under the assumption that the law is merely a tool for your own ego. You falsified the reason for the stop, and I have no doubt you have perjured yourself in your arrest report." "Watch your mouth," Harlan threatened, stepping closer. "You're lucky you're walking out of here." "Oh, I'm not lucky. I'm simply patient," Lena replied. She looked him dead in the eye, her gaze completely unyielding. "I will see you in court, Officer Crow. Be sure to wear your best uniform. You're going to need it." Without waiting for a response, she turned and walked out of the precinct, the heavy glass doors swinging shut behind her. Harlan stood there, his fists clenched, laughing off the interaction to Officer Miller, who was watching from a few desks away. "Crazy lady," Harlan muttered. But as he sat back down at his desk and looked at the carbon copy of his falsified police report, that tiny sliver of doubt began to grow. Weeks had passed since the arrest. For Officer Harlan Crow, it had been business as usual. He had written a dozen more tickets, made 3 more questionable arrests, and completely put the woman in the faded sweatshirt out of his mind. Today was his designated court day, where he would testify in his recent arrests. It was a day for overtime pay and strutting around the courthouse. He stood in the men's room of the Cedar County Municipal Courthouse, adjusting his tie in the mirror. He was wearing his Class A uniform, crispa navy blue, brass buttons polished to a mirror shine, shoes gleaming. He checked his hair, gave himself a confident nod, and walked out into the busy hallway. The corridor was a sea of nervous defendants, overworked public defenders in wrinkled suits, and bored police officers. Harlan spotted Assistant District Attorney Brian Wallace leaning against the wall near Department 14. Brian was young, fresh out of law school, and perpetually overwhelmed. "Hey, Wallace," Harlan greeted, slapping the young ADA on the shoulder. "We got the Harper case today, right? Resisting and disorderly." Brian looked down at his overflowing manila folder. He frowned. "Yeah, Harper. Hey, just a heads up, Crow. This case is weird." "What's weird about it?" Harlan scoffed. "Open and shut. Traffic stop. She got loud. She got handsy. I hooked her up." Brian shook his head. "First of all, her defense attorney is Robert Sterling." Harlan's brow furrowed. The name sounded familiar. "Who?" "Robert Sterling, senior partner at Sterling Vance and Associates," Brian said, his voice tight. "He doesn't do municipal traffic courts, Crow. He defends white-collar billionaires and politicians. He charges $1,000 an hour. I don't know how a county clerk afforded him." "Maybe it's pro bono," Harlan said defensively, though a knot began to form in his stomach. "Maybe," Brian muttered. "Also, the docket is messed up today. Judge Peterson had a family emergency. They brought in a heavy hitter from the Superior Court Appellate Division to cover the municipal docket for the morning. Someone from the downtown courthouse." "Whatever. A judge is a judge," Harlan said, feigning nonchalance. "Let's just get in there and get this over with." They pushed through the heavy mahogany doors into the courtroom of Department 14. It was an imposing room, all dark wood paneling and high ceilings designed to make the citizen feel small and the law feel monumental. Harlan walked past the gallery benches and took a seat in the front row directly behind the prosecution's table. He scanned the room. The gallery was mostly empty, save for a few people waiting for their traffic tickets to be called. He looked for the black woman in the yoga pants and sweatshirt. He wanted to see her squirm in her seat. He wanted to see the realization hit her that she was in his house now. But she was not there. Instead, sitting calmly at the defense table was a distinguished silver-haired man in a bespoke three-piece charcoal suit. It was Robert Sterling. He was meticulously arranging a few files on the desk in front of him. There was no client sitting next to him. The defendant's chair was glaringly empty. Harlan leaned forward, tapping Brian, the ADA, on the shoulder. "Where's the defendant? If she doesn't show, you ask for a bench warrant, right?" "She'll show," Brian whispered back, looking nervously at Sterling. Sterling wouldn't be sitting there looking that relaxed if his client was skipping bail. Suddenly, the side door near the judge's bench opened. Arthur Briggs, a massive, imposing bailiff who had worked in the courthouse for decades, stepped out. He carried a heavy clipboard and looked out over the room with a stern, no-nonsense glare. Harlan smiled. He knew Arthur. Arthur always made sure the cops were treated well in this building. Arthur cleared his throat and boomed, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "All rise." Everyone in the courtroom, including Harlan and the ADA, stood to their feet. "The Superior Court of Cedar County Municipal Division is now in session," Arthur bellowed. "The Honorable Judge Lena Harper presiding. All those having business before this court, draw near and give your attention. Please be seated." Harlan Hayes froze. The breath hitched in his throat. His ears began to ring, a high-pitched whine that drowned out the rustling of the gallery taking their seats. Judge Lena Harper. He stared at the heavy oak doors leading to the judge's private chambers. The handle turned. Stepping out from the chambers was not an old white-haired man. It was a black woman. She was no longer wearing a faded collegiate sweatshirt or yoga pants. She was draped in the heavy flowing black robes of a superior court judge. Her hair was perfectly styled and her posture was impeccably regal. She walked up the steps to the elevated bench. She did not look at the gallery. She did not look at the ADA. She took her seat in the high-backed leather chair, adjusted the microphone in front of her, and finally, slowly, lifted her eyes. Her gaze locked dead onto Officer Harlan Crow, who was still standing, his knees suddenly feeling like they were made of water. Judge Lena Harper stared at the man who had handcuffed her, assaulted her, and lied about her weeks ago. The icy resolve in her eyes was the exact same look she had given him in the holding cell, but now it was backed by the full crushing weight of the judicial branch of the government. She picked up her wooden gavel and struck the sounding block with a sharp, echoing crack. "Let's begin," she said. The silence in Department 14 was absolute, possessing a physical weight that seemed to press down on Officer Harlan Crow's chest, suffocating him. He stood paralyzed in the front row of the gallery, his polished black shoes feeling as though they had been cemented to the floor. The woman he had violently shoved into the back of his cruiser, the woman he had mocked and fingerprinted, was looking down at him from the elevated oak bench. Judge Lena Harper, a superior court judge. Harlan's mind raced, desperately trying to find a rational explanation, a loophole in the reality unfolding before him. This is a mistake, he thought, his pulse hammering a frantic rhythm against his eardrums. It's a coincidence, a relative, a prank. but the cold, terrifyingly calm eyes staring back at him allowed no room for delusion. It was her. Assistant District Attorney Brian Wallace, still standing at the prosecutor's table, was utterly oblivious to the psychological execution taking place behind him. He fumbled with his overflowing stack of manila folders, finally pulling out the one labeled State of Cedar versus Harper. "S, Your Honor," Brian stammered, his voice cracking slightly as he adjusted his microphone. "The state calls docket number 402A, State versus Lena Harper. The charges are disorderly conduct and resisting an officer without violence." Brian looked toward the defense table, expecting the defendant to step forward and stand beside Robert Sterling. He saw no one. Then a horrifying realization began to creep up his spine. He looked at the name on the file. Lena Harper. He looked up at the brass nameplate sitting squarely on the bench. Honorable Lena Harper. The blood drained from the young ADA's face, leaving him a sickly shade of gray. He swallowed hard, his eyes darting frantically between the file and the bench. Judge Harper did not smile. She clasped her hands together, resting them on the polished wood. "Mr. Wallace," she began, her voice resonating with an effortless, commanding authority that filled the cavernous room. "It appears there is a rather glaring conflict of interest on today's docket. As I am the named defendant in the matter you just called, the judicial canons of ethics require my immediate recusal from adjudicating my own case." A collective gasp rippled through the few civilians sitting in the back rows. Arthur Briggs, the veteran bailiff, narrowed his eyes, suddenly realizing exactly what was happening. He took a subtle step closer to Harlan, his hand resting lightly on his utility belt. Your Honor," Brian stuttered, looking as though he might faint. I was unaware. The file it came across my desk this morning. I apologize to the court." "The apology is noted, Mr. Wallace, though unnecessary for you personally," Judge Harper replied smoothly. "However, the district attorney's office was made aware of this discrepancy late last night, which is why I believe your superior is here to handle this specific matter." At that precise moment, the heavy mahogany double doors at the back of the courtroom swung open. Striding down the center aisle was Harrison Caldwell, the chief district attorney for Cedar County. Caldwell was a notoriously ruthless prosecutor, a man who built his career on political optics and crushing convictions. He did not look happy. Trailing slightly behind him was a nervous-looking man in a wrinkled suit, Gregory F. Mitchell, the primary legal counsel for the local Police Benevolent Association. Harlan's stomach plummeted into an icy abyss. The presence of the chief, DA, and the union lawyer meant this was no longer a routine traffic docket. This was a targeted strike. "May it please the court," Harrison Caldwell announced, his deep voice carrying an edge of barely contained fury. He stepped past a trembling Brian Wallace and took the podium. "The state of Cedar officially moves to dismiss all charges against Lena Harper in docket 402A with prejudice. The charges were completely unfounded, and the arrest was entirely unlawful." "Motion to dismiss with prejudice is granted," Judge Harper stated, striking her gavel once. "The record will reflect the dismissal." "Furthermore, Your Honor," Caldwell continued, turning slightly so his profile was visible to Harlan, "the district attorney's office is formally opening a Brady disclosure file on the arresting officer, Harlan Crow. Additionally, we are requesting this court convene an immediate order to show cause hearing regarding Officer Crow's sworn affidavit of probable cause, which we have reason to believe contains multiple counts of aggravated perjury." Harlan's knees finally buckled. He dropped heavily onto the wooden bench, his crisp uniform suddenly feeling like a straitjacket. Aggravated perjury. It was a felony. It meant prison time. It meant the end of his life as he knew it. "Very well, Mr. Caldwell," Judge Harper said, her tone shifting from formal detachment to the sharp edge of an inquisitor. "As the chief administrative judge of this circuit, I am authorized to preside over preliminary inquiries into officer misconduct that occur within the jurisdiction of this courthouse. Let us proceed with the order to show cause. Is Officer Harlan Crow present in the courtroom?" "He is, Your Honor." Robert Sterling spoke up for the first time. The high-priced defense attorney stood, turning around to point a manicured finger directly at Harlan, who was shrinking into the pew, sitting in the front row, sweating. Judge Harper's eyes locked onto Harlan once more. The trap had not just sprung. Its steel jaws had shattered his reality. "Officer Crow," Judge Harper commanded, the authority in her voice vibrating through the floorboards, "step forward and take the witness stand. You are about to explain to this court exactly how a routine trip to buy sourdough bread escalated into a violent fabricated arrest." The walk from the gallery bench to the witness stand was the longest 30 feet of Harlan Crow's life. His vision tunneled. The polished brass buttons of his uniform, usually a source of immense pride, now felt like targets painted on his chest. He took the stand, his hand trembling so violently he could barely raise it to swear the oath administered by the court clerk. Gregory F. Mitchell, the union attorney, hurried to sit in the chair next to the witness box. His face flushed. "Your Honor," Mitchell interrupted, his voice reedy, "I object to this proceeding. Officer Crow has not been formally charged with a crime, and placing him under oath without a formal indictment violates his Fifth Amendment rights." "Overruled, Mr. Mitchell," Judge Harper replied instantly, not even glancing at a law book. "This is a fact-finding inquiry regarding a sworn document submitted to this court. If your client feels that answering truthfully will incriminate him, he is welcome to invoke his Fifth Amendment privilege on the record in open court for every single question asked, but he will sit there and he will be questioned." Mitchell swallowed hard and leaned over, whispering frantically into Harlan's ear. "If you plead the Fifth, you lose your badge today. If you lie, you go to prison. Stick to your report. They can't prove a negative." Harlan nodded numbly. He gripped the edges of the wooden witness box, his knuckles turning white. He just needed to hold the line. He was a cop. The system was designed to protect him. It always had. Harrison Caldwell approached the podium holding a blown-up posterized copy of Harlan's handwritten arrest report. "Officer Crow?" Caldwell began, adjusting his glasses. "I hold here the sworn affidavit you submitted under penalty of perjury on the day of the incident. Do you recognize this document?" "Yes," Harlan croaked. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Yes, sir. In this report, you state that you initiated a traffic stop on a 2024 Mercedes-Benz because the driver failed to activate a turn signal 100 feet prior to an intersection. Is that correct?" "That is correct," Harlan said, his voice gaining a fraction of its usual arrogance. "It was a technicality, but it was a legal one." "You further stated," Caldwell continued, reading directly from the board, "upon approaching the vehicle, the suspect was belligerent, refused lawful commands to provide identification, and made sudden furtive movements toward the glove compartment, causing me to fear for my safety." "Did you write those words, Officer Crow?" "I did, and it's the truth," Harlan lied, his eyes darting toward the union rep. Judge Harper leaned forward. She did not look angry. She looked profoundly disappointed, like a scientist observing a particularly slow rat failing a maze. "Mr. Caldwell, let's dispense with the theatrics," Judge Harper interjected smoothly. "Please direct the court's attention to the audiovisual evidence submitted to the clerk this morning." Harlan frowned. He had checked his body camera footage before submitting the report. He had conveniently forgotten to double-tap the activation button until after he had pulled her out of the car. The dash cam was on, but the rain had obscured the view through the Mercedes rear window. There was no video of the interaction inside the car. He was sure of it. "Yes, Your Honor," Caldwell said, pulling a flash drive from his pocket and handing it to the bailiff, who plugged it into the courtroom's AV system. A large flat-screen monitor lowered from the ceiling. "Officer Crow, you chose to execute this traffic stop at the intersection of Elm Grove and the residential neighborhood of Oakbrook," Caldwell stated. "Are you familiar with the residents on the northwest corner of that intersection?" Harlan blinked. "No." "It is the home of Dr. William Harris," Caldwell explained. "Doctor. Harris is a prominent cardiologist who recently installed a high-definition 4K audio-enabled security perimeter around his property following a string of package thefts. His camera angle perfectly captures the intersection, the stop line, and the exact spot where you pulled over Judge Harper's vehicle." The blood rushed out of Harlan's head so fast he felt dizzy. Caldwell clicked a remote. The screen flickered to life. The courtroom watched the pristine, crystal-clear footage. It showed the black Mercedes approaching the stop sign. A small graphic on the bottom of the security footage indicated distance. The Mercedes activated its right turn signal exactly 112 feet before the intersection. "Pause right there," Caldwell ordered. He looked at Harlan. "Officer Crow, your stated probable cause for this stop was a failure to signal at 100 feet. This video clearly shows the signal activated at over 110 feet. Your legal pretext for the stop was a fabrication." Harlan's mouth opened, but no sound came out. He looked at Mitchell, who was violently rubbing his forehead. "Play the rest," Judge Harper instructed, her voice devoid of emotion. The video continued. It showed Harlan's cruiser pulling up. Because the security camera was mounted on a low brick pillar near the sidewalk, it provided an unobstructed illuminated view straight through the passenger side window of the Mercedes. The high-fidelity audio picked up the ambient sound of the rain. And then, with terrifying clarity, Harlan's own voice boomed through the wet air. I ask the questions here. License and registration. Now. The courtroom watched as the woman in the faded sweatshirt calmly, slowly, and narratively retrieved her documents. There were no furtive movements. There was no belligerence. She handed them over. They heard her politely ask for the articulable suspicion. They heard Harlan escalate the situation, his voice dripping with venom. They watched as she stepped out of the car, entirely compliant, hands visible. And then the courtroom watched in dead silence as Harlan Crow violently grabbed the arm of a compliant, unarmed superior court judge, twisting it painfully behind her back before slamming the cuffs onto her wrists. When the video ended, the silence in the courtroom was deafening. The lie was not just exposed, it was eviscerated. The sworn affidavit sitting on the podium was not just inaccurate, it was a malicious piece of fiction. Caldwell turned off the monitor and looked at the broken man in the witness stand. Officer Crow, would you like to revise your previous testimony regarding your fear for your safety? Harlan was hyperventilating. Sweat dripped down his temples, stinging his eyes. He looked up at Judge Harper. For the first time, he did not see a black woman he could bully. He saw the sheer, unadulterated power of the justice system bearing down on him, a system he had abused for years, now turning its teeth toward him. I made a mistake, Harlan stammered, his tough guy facade completely shattered. It was raining. I thought she was reaching for something. Crack. Judge Harper struck her gavel, cutting him off. Do not insult the intelligence of this court, Mr. Crow, she said, her voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet register. You did not make a mistake. You made a choice. You looked at a citizen and made an assumption based on your own prejudice and arrogance. You believed that a badge granted you immunity from the truth. You believed you were the law. She stood up from her chair, the black robes billowing slightly. She looked down at him, an avenging angel of jurisprudence. The law, Judge Harper stated softly, is not a weapon for you to wield against those you deem beneath you. It is a shield to protect them from men exactly like you. She turned her attention to the Chief District Attorney. Mr. Caldwell. Yes, Your Honor. Caldwell stood at attention. Based on the indisputable video evidence presented and the directly contradictory testimony given under oath by this officer, I am finding probable cause that Harlan Crow has committed the felony offense of aggravated perjury as well as official oppression under color of law. Judge Harper declared, her words ringing like church bells. She looked at Arthur Briggs, the bailiff. Bailiff, Judge Harper ordered, take him into custody. Arthur Briggs did not hesitate. The camaraderie of law enforcement ended where the desecration of the court began. He walked purposefully toward the witness stand, unhooking his own heavy metal handcuffs. Stand up, Crow, Arthur grunted, grabbing Harlan by the bicep the exact same way Harlan had grabbed Lena Harper weeks prior. Wait, please, Your Honor. Please, Harlan begged, his voice cracking into a high-pitched whine. The humiliation was absolute. He was in his Class A uniform, standing in open court, begging for mercy from the woman he had tried to destroy. Put your hands behind your back, Arthur commanded, spinning Harlan around. The heavy metal clicked and ratcheted tightly around Officer Harlan Crow's wrists. The cold steel bit into his skin, a stark physical reminder of the karma he had so desperately earned. As Harlan was marched toward the holding cell door, his head bowed, his career destroyed, and his freedom stripped away, Judge Harper sat back down in her leather chair. She adjusted the microphone, her face a mask of perfect, impenetrable calm. Call the next case, she said. Mr. Wallace. The holding cell in the basement of the Cedar County Municipal Courthouse smelled of industrial bleach and old sweat. It was a smell Officer Harlan Crow knew intimately, though he was entirely accustomed to being on the other side of the iron bars, breathing free air while he watched the cage squirm. Now the metallic clank of the lock sliding into place sounded like a thunderclap, sealing his doom. He sat on the cold steel bench, staring at the floor. His crisp navy blue uniform, stripped of his duty belt, his radio and his weapon, felt like a Halloween costume. His wrist chafed red from the heavy cuffs Arthur Briggs had applied with zero gentleness, throbbed in time with his racing heartbeat. He was no longer a predator, he was the prey, swallowed whole by the very system he had thought he mastered. An hour passed in suffocating silence before the heavy steel door to the cell block squealed open. Footsteps echoed down the corridor, measured, deliberate, and lacking any of the casual camaraderie Harlan was used to from his fellow officers. Gregory F., Mitchell, the Police Benevolent Association attorney, stepped up to the bars. He did not look at Harlan with pity. He looked at him with the cold, calculating disgust of a man assessing a toxic asset. Standing next to Mitchell was Captain Thomas Orr, the head of the precinct's Internal Affairs Division, holding a thick manila folder. "Greg," Harlan croaked, standing up quickly, grabbing the bars. "Greg, you gotta get me out of here. Post bail. Call the union president. We can spin this." The camera angle was bad. It was raining. Shut up, Crow," Mitchell snapped, his voice a harsh, ready whip. "Just shut your mouth before you make this worse. You're not spinning a 4K audio-synced security video that perfectly catches you committing a textbook felony and civil rights violation against a sitting Superior Court judge." Harlan blinked, his hands sliding down the cold iron bars. "But the union, you have to represent me. It's in the bylaws." Mitchell adjusted his tie, his expression flattening into absolute indifference. "The PBA bylaws state that we provide legal defense for officers involved in incidents arising from the good faith execution of their duties. Section 4, paragraph B, explicitly voids that protection in cases of deliberate, malicious, and aggravated perjury." You lied on a sworn affidavit, Crow. You got caught on tape doing it. The union is officially severing ties. You're on your own. You need to hire a private criminal defense attorney if you can afford one. The blood rushed from Harlan's face. The union was his shield. Without them, he was financially and legally naked against the infinite resources of the district attorney's office. Mitchell turned on his heel and walked away without another word. Captain Orr stepped closer to the bars, his face a mask of weary anger. "You really stepped in it this time, Crow. We're not just looking at the Harper arrest anymore." "What do you mean?" Harlan whispered, a new, colder terror gripping his chest. "When a cop gets caught lying on an arrest report to frame a judge, it triggers an automatic mandatory audit of every single arrest that officer has ever made." Orr explained, his voice eerily calm. "Chief D.A. Caldwell just secured a warrant for your locker, your personal vehicle, and every MDT search you've executed in the last several years. We are pulling the body cam footage of every traffic stop you've ever conducted." "You can't do that," Harlan panicked, his voice pitching high. "That's a witch hunt." "No, Crow. It's a systemic integrity review." Orr corrected him sharply. "And we've only been digging for hours. Do you remember a kid named David Carmichael, 19 years old? You pulled him over months ago for a broken taillight that miraculously wasn't broken when the impound lot processed it. You charged him with resisting arrest and possession. He lost his college scholarship because of that felony charge." Harlan swallowed hard. He remembered David Carmichael, a young black kid driving a nice Honda Civic in a good neighborhood. Harlan had tossed the kid's car, found nothing, but was so irritated by the kid's attitude that he claimed he smelled marijuana and escalated the situation. "We found the dashcam footage from that night," Orr continued mercilessly. "You muted your microphone halfway through the stop, but you forgot the interior cab mic was still recording. We heard you tell your partner that you were going to teach this punk a lesson. You ruined that boy's life over your bruised ego." Orr leaned in close to the bars. "You didn't just target a judge, Crow. You established a pattern and practice of racially motivated pretextual stops, followed by fabricated charges to cover your tracks. The FBI Civil Rights Division was notified hours ago. They're taking jurisdiction. You're not just facing state perjury charges, you're looking at federal civil rights violations under Title 18, United States Code, Section 242. Harlan stumbled backward, his legs giving out. He hit the cinder block wall and slid down to the cold floor. Federal charges, the FBI. The realization of his absolute destruction crashed over him. The shield of qualified immunity, the legal doctrine that protected police officers from personal liability, was completely shattered the moment he committed deliberate perjury. Over the next days, Harlan Crow's life was systematically dismantled. He was formally terminated from the police force. The local news media obtained the security footage from Dr. Harris's house. It was broadcast on a continuous loop across national television networks. The image of the arrogant, aggressive white officer forcefully grabbing the calm, composed black Superior Court judge became an instant symbol of systemic abuse. Dozens of Harlan's past victims came forward. The district attorney's office had to dismiss over 40 active criminal cases where Harlan was the primary arresting officer, releasing innocent people from jail and expunging their records. Civil lawsuits began to pile up, naming Harlan personally because he had acted outside the scope of his lawful duties by committing perjury. The city refused to indemnify him. He lost his house. He lost his savings. He lost his pension. He was entirely, utterly ruined before the trial even began. Months later, the sky above the United States District Court in downtown Cedar City was a brilliant, unforgiving blue. Inside courtroom 3B, the air was heavily conditioned and painfully tense. This was not the municipal traffic court where Harlan had once strutted like a king. This was federal court. Harlan Crow sat at the defense table. He looked years older. The arrogant swagger was entirely gone, replaced by the hollow, sunken posture of a broken man. He was dressed in a standard-issue orange jail-issued jumpsuit, having been denied bail due to the severity of the charges and the flight risk he posed after losing all his assets. His public defender, an exhausted woman named Sarah Higgins, sat beside him, reviewing notes with a grim expression. Presiding over the case was the Honorable Philip Harrison, an older, stern federal judge known for his absolute intolerance of public corruption. The prosecution, led by Assistant United States Attorney Eleanor Bennett, had spent the last several days methodically dissecting Harlan's career. They had not just played the tape of Judge Harper's arrest. They had paraded a heartbreaking line of citizens to the witness stand. David Carmichael testified about losing his scholarship. A local bakery owner named Marcus Thorne testified about being slammed against a brick wall for asking why his van was being searched. The defense had nothing. They could not argue the facts because the facts were on high-definition video. They could not argue intent because the audio recordings of Harlan bragging to other officers demonstrated clear malice. But the fatal blow, the true, undeniable climax of the trial, came on the afternoon of the final day. The United States calls Lena Harper to the stand, Assistant U.S. Attorney Bennett announced. A hush fell over the packed gallery. Reporters leaned forward, pens hovering over legal pads. The heavy wooden doors opened and Lena Harper walked in. She was not wearing her judicial robes. She was dressed in a sharp, immaculately tailored charcoal gray suit. She walked with the exact same imposing, unyielding dignity she had displayed on the side of the road in Oakbrook months prior. As she walked past the defense table, she did not look at Harlan. He was a ghost to her, a minor, pathetic obstacle she had already overcome. She took the stand, swore the oath, and sat down, adjusting the microphone. Judge Harper, Assistant U.S. Attorney Bennett began gently, "Could you please recount for the jury the events of the incident?" For the next hour, Lena Harper spoke. She did not exaggerate. She did not embellish. She recounted the stop with the clinical, devastating precision of a legal scholar. She explained the law to the jury, outlining exactly how Harlan had violated the Fourth Amendment, how he had fabricated the pretext, and how he had used the threat of violence to enforce his illegal detention. "When he placed the handcuffs on you, Judge Harper," Assistant U.S. Attorney Bennett asked, the courtroom completely silent, "were you afraid for your physical safety?" Lena paused. She looked directly at the jury box. "I was aware that I was in physical danger," Lena replied, her voice steady and clear. Officer Crow was armed, agitated, and acting entirely outside the bounds of the law. But I was not afraid. I was profoundly angry because I knew the law. I knew my rights. I knew exactly how to survive that encounter so that I could hold him accountable. She shifted her gaze, finally looking directly at Harlan Crow. He flinched, physically shrinking into his chair. "But as I sat in the back of his patrol car," Lena continued, her voice echoing in the cavernous room, "I thought about the people who do not know the law, the people who do not have a law degree, or a prominent defense attorney on speed dial, or the platform of a judicial bench. I thought about the teenagers, the single mothers, the working-class citizens who this man had undoubtedly terrorized. The badge he wore is a sacred trust. He weaponized it to feed his own ego. He did not just assault me, he assaulted the very foundation of the justice system he swore to protect." The jury looked devastated. Two of the jurors were openly wiping tears from their eyes. Even Judge Harrison looked deeply moved, his jaw set in a tight line. The defense did not cross-examine her. There was nothing to ask. The jury deliberated for hours. They returned a verdict of guilty on all counts: deprivation of rights under color of law, aggravated perjury, and obstruction of justice. Weeks later, Harlan stood before Judge Harrison for sentencing. The courtroom was packed. Harlan Crow, Judge Harrison spoke, his voice heavy with condemnation. "You were entrusted with the power of the state. You were given a weapon, a badge, and the authority to deprive citizens of their liberty in the pursuit of justice. Instead, you used that power to exact petty tyranny over those you believed were defenseless. You operated under the cowardly assumption that the uniform protected you from the consequences of your own prejudice." Judge Harrison looked down at his papers, then back up at the broken man in orange. "The irony of your situation is not lost on this court. You attempted to humiliate a woman who embodied the law, and in doing so, you summoned the full righteous fury of the law upon yourself. The damage you have done to the public trust in law enforcement is incalculable." Judge Harrison struck his gavel. "It is the judgment of this court that you be committed to the custody of the Federal Bureau of Prisons to serve a term of 120 months, 10 years, without the possibility of early parole. Upon your release, you will be subject to 3 years of supervised probation. You are forever barred from holding any position of public trust or law enforcement. May God have mercy on your soul, because this court will not." The gavel cracked a second time, sealing his fate. Harlan Crow was led out of the courtroom in heavy steel chains, his head bowed, weeping silently. He was transported to a high-security federal penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas. In the complex hierarchy of the prison yard, a disgraced former cop who abused his power sat at the absolute bottom. The men he was now forced to live with did not care about his former authority. To them, he was just another inmate, powerless, terrified, and entirely at their mercy. Karma had not just knocked on his door, it had kicked it down and dragged him into the dark. Meanwhile, back in Cedar County, the Honorable Judge Lena Harper returned to her chambers. She hung her coat on the rack, poured herself a cup of black coffee, and put on her heavy black robes. She picked up her first case file of the day, walked out into her courtroom, and sat behind the elevated oak bench. She looked out over the room, her eyes sharp, observant, and entirely unyielding. The system was broken in many places, and she knew one trial would not fix it all. But as she picked up her wooden gavel, she knew that today, at least, the scales were perfectly balanced. The story of Harlan Crow and Judge Lena Harper stands as a chilling modern-day fable about the intoxicating poison of unchecked power and the inevitable crushing weight of karma. It serves as a stark reminder that the uniform does not elevate a person above the law. Rather, it binds them to it with far greater scrutiny. Crow operated under a dangerous illusion, relying on prejudice and fear to mask his incompetence, only to have his reality shattered by a woman who refused to be a victim. Judge Harper's unyielding composure dismantled a corrupt officer, not with violence, but with the undeniable structural force of the justice system itself. Ultimately, this narrative underscores a fundamental truth. Tyranny thrives only in the shadows of accountability. When brought into the searing light of truth, arrogant authority collapses, proving that the law, when wielded justly, remains the great equalizer.